Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps two headline figures to keep in your mind as we listen to our next two speakers. A 20% increase in recorded hate crimes across Wales, and the second headline, it's estimated 48% are still going unreported. Now, our next speaker is a police superintendent working within the Ministry of Justice in the UK. He leads the cross-government hate crime programme, which brings all sectors of government together to coordinate efforts to improve the response to hate crime from across the criminal justice system. He's the national point of contact to the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights on hate crime, and has worked to share good practice within the OSCE region and within America. He's also a member of the Association of Chief Police Officers, Hate Crime Group, and the author of the 2014 ACPO Hate Crime Manual, which offers guidance to all UK police officers and partners. So he really has written the book. I don't know if he's got the t-shirt. He's the co-editor of the 2014 Routledge International Handbook on Hate Crime. And I'm delighted to say congratulations, awarded an OBE in last year's New Year's Honours List for services to policing, equality and human rights. It's a very great pleasure to have him here today. So ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Paul Giannasi. Thank you.
I'm going to start off really where Claire finished, and that comment that there is no silver bullet for this. It's a solution to a problem that probably isn't there to be had, and I'm going to explain why. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the challenges that we face in relation to hate crime on the internet, and some of the challenges that we face as organisations, and how we're going with policy to try and find some of the common ground in the diametrically opposed views of different states and different actors within the arena. So we talk about hate on the internet, and actually it's in a very different context that it gets talked in different forums and different countries. What we have is in the previous government's action plan, which is about to be refreshed, and I'll make this plug now, that ministers have asked us to rewrite a hate crime action plan for England and Wales, taking the rest of this Parliament together. And if there are suggestions that come out of today, or suggestions that people have of things that we can do to reduce the harm that it's caused, then we would very much like to hear about them today or afterwards. And that was really the wording of the action in the last action plan. We as a programme were tasked with reducing the harm caused by hate on the internet, recognising that legislation exists, and we're going to talk about some of it, but also recognising the harm that's caused by things that are unlikely to be illegal or made illegal, given the challenges, not just of free speech, but also about the importance of media and social media as basic foundations of democracy. And we can all cite examples from countries that we would see as oppressive in the oppression of free speech, where the use of social media is almost like a beacon of light out of dark, and that was something that is maybe a third factor which makes the conversation more complex. I'm going to talk about the lost connection. We can connect with Brisbane, but we can't get to the back there. Right, I'm just going to put into perspective where we are in terms of hate crime in general. So just a couple of slides, just to talk about the way the UK approaches hate crime. And we are undoubtedly at the top of the game when it comes to hate crime. We are not where we would want to be, and stats like we've just heard explain that we're not as good as we should be, but actually we're significantly better at responding to hate crime in general. So I'll put some figures here of different countries and the number of hate crimes they record, because we start from a point of saying that we know that hate crime is underreported. So actually when we see the measure of success being more hate crime, it feels counterintuitive, but we know that so many are underreported anyway. So we see people having the confidence to report, and the agencies having the systems to allow people to report as a really positive step. When you look at that comparison, you'll see that we really do lead the way internationally. So So that's the OSCE region there. And what that works out pro rata is that if you look at ourselves in the US, it either says that we are 43 times more racist and more hostile in the UK, or that we're more cognizant of the problem and more willing to recognise the problem. So where are we then in relation to England and Wales? So in the data that was mentioned earlier, that was released on Tuesday, there was a significant rise in 18% in England and Wales, and as you heard, 20%. So quite a significant rise in hate crime. There was a number of factors that have played out in that. Things like the reaction to the conflict in Gaza, the reaction to high-profile incidents in this country and elsewhere, and terrorism, have seen an increase. But actually, an 18% increase across the board is significant. There was a 25% increase in disability hate crime, which is a real positive when we know that so few are recorded. So we see that as a positive, given the figure that you see there, 222,000, is the estimate on the Crime Survey of England and Wales. And that is down from 272,000 the last time it was assessed 2 years ago. So what we're seeing is a positive move. We're seeing an increase in hate crime, but a decrease in people's experiences of hate crime, if that data is to be relied on. And obviously we need to see trends over years. But you'll see how the crime breaks down there. You'll see that around 80% of the hate crime that we record is racist. But what you'll also see is a number of crimes, what you will hopefully see. Processing manually, sorry. So what you'll see in these figures that come in is the crime survey estimate. So 106,000, which is telling us that sort of less than 50% of race hate crimes are reported. When you look down and you look at the other figures, particularly around disability, you'll see that gap is massive, that it's a significantly greater gap, that far less crimes are being recorded or reported. So there's two issues. What it also shows us is that around about 48% of those crimes came to the attention of the police. So we have two issues. One is about under-reporting, where 52% of people didn't tell the authorities or we didn't get to know. But there's also an issue when you look at that about under-recording, of things that we know about that we recorded as the core crime, but haven't recognised the hate crime element of it. So with that in mind, what I'm going to talk about is some of the challenges of the internet. I'm going to stop this and just... I'll try and cover it. Some of the challenges of the internet. Sorry, this is going to catch up. Right, okay, so I'm going to have to look backwards for a second, sorry. So the issue of the internet, there are sites that have been in existence for as long as the internet's been there. Stormfront, which is the site of the Ku Klux Klan group in the US, is argued to be one of the longest running continuous and available websites in existence. The far right, particularly in the US, were early adopters of the internet and they saw the value of it. And whilst it was horrible stuff, it was really deeply offensive, racist material, it didn't cause anxiety in communities in the UK because people weren't exposed to it. The only people who found it were the people who were looking to observe what they did, or the like-minded supporters. And what Web 2.0, or what we would call Web 2.0, incorrectly I'm told, is really changed everything, because it meant that I no longer had to have my own space or get through somebody else's editorial control to post material. I could post it on the comments page of a newspaper, I could post it on somebody else's social media network. And it was really that interactivity that allowed the anonymity, it allowed me not to own the space. And it's a combination of those issues which I think has played out so much more as to why this has become an issue so much for the communities. And when we were planning for the last action plan, it was one that the independent advisory group were really quite keen that we should be starting to address. So when we start to address them, one of the challenges is the international disparity. And I can't overstate the importance of the First Amendment of the US Constitution. And you'll hear from Nick, and Twitter is one of the many companies that are US-based. And the First Amendment of the US Constitution says words to the effect of Congress shall pass no law which restricts a person's freedom of expression, amongst other things. And what that's taken to be, by most observers in America, is that unless you're inciting hatred and with a clear and present danger as the terminology, you can say what you like, and your right to say that is far greater than my right to be protected from. So with that in mind, lots of the companies would see that as the basis of their policy and would say, well, that's just not our job to control. And if things are illegal, then that's fine. We will deal with it, bring us a subpoena from the US court, and we will give you what information you want. So it becomes a really difficult situation. And kind of the stance of the US and the perceptions of officials within the US is the role of the state to have thicker skins and not be so affected by this. So actually seeking collaboration across states is really difficult. Seeking collaboration with the industry, largely US-based industry, has been very difficult. And I'll talk about some of the progress. But there is also apathy in some fronts. There is also some countries who would seek to oppress political opposition by using hate crime legislation to oppress people who oppose them. And within the industry, there is a real problem. People talk about the big three, and Nick is very much in the front line. People will see the internet as Facebook and Twitter largely, and occasionally Google and Pinterest and one or two others. But actually, the internet is a myriad of companies, some of them who are two 17-year-old lads with a laptop working out of one of them in the bedroom, who've set up a service, and they're not necessarily speaking for each other. Nick will speak for Twitter, can't speak for Facebook, and nobody can speak, and there is no body that we would engage with. And we're probably about 10 years behind the game in the conversations that we're having. And Mike and I were bleary-eyed because arriving back from meetings with Facebook and Twitter and Google and lots of others this week. But the reality is that the conversations we probably ought to have been having 10 years ago, and we didn't anticipate what we were going to be challenging. So what I'll finish off with when I come to it is talking about how the internet is an opportunity for us as well as a threat. And there's a couple of gaps in our academic knowledge. We use phrases like the testimony of the advisory group to cover things that we think but we don't know. And two of them are the link between exposure to hate material and physical offending. So we know that when we look back at Rosanara Chowdhury, who stabbed Stephen Timms MP, when we look back at David Copeland, who set off the bombs in London in 1999, they have been exposed to hate material, which clearly had some motivational impact. But we also know that our own staff and people who work in this area will be exposed to hate all the time, and we don't go out and kill people because of it. So what we don't know is whether it is a cause or an effect of that relationship. It would be really good if we could get academic evidence to prove that one way or the other. I accept the difficulties. But also, it's difficult to know the fear of crime that exposure creates. So if I'm gay and I'm exposed to material which is deeply homophobic on a day-to-day basis, does it make me more or less safe in society? Does it make me fear crime more? And we perhaps need to understand that better. Okay, move on. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the legal framework, and we're going to explore this more in the workshop. I'm not wanting to sell our workshop. But we've got this issue about this hate speech versus hate crime debate. We've also got, so go on, please. Okay, so we've also got legislation across Europe, or commitments across Europe, which commit the state to act rather than creating a new law. So we've got an EU framework decision on racism and xenophobia, which the UK opted out of, but we're actually still compliant with. And that says that all states should have the capacity to criminalise incitement of hatred on the grounds of racism and xenophobia. There was also an additional protocol to the European Convention on Cybercrime, which talks about having legislation to combat hate online, which again we didn't opt into, but we do feel we're compliant with. And the best we've managed within the OSCE is a commitment, because the OSCE includes America, it's very important, and the best we managed is a commitment that states would work together to seek to collaborate to reduce the harm on the internet, and it's no more specific than that. So there's a couple of really important cases, which again we'll explore and Mike will explore in more detail in the workshop. But there was a case of a French case of a man called Frank Garaudy, who was a Holocaust denier. And he was prosecuted in France where Holocaust denial is a specific offence. and claimed that that was a breach of his human rights and right to free speech. And the courts rejected that, saying that that right to free speech doesn't extend to inciting hatred and rewriting history. So the governments, if you take that as the example, do have that obligation and responsibility of challenging that material. And there's a really interesting case of Delphi versus Estonia, which has just been appealed and upheld, which basically says that a host of material is responsible for the content that's on there. So what that's effectively saying, in this case, there was criminal material added on by a third party. Delphi was the host, who were the web host that had it, and Estonia, as the government, prosecuted them because of that material. And they argued that because they were just providing a space, they weren't culpable for it, and the prosecution was upheld. And the ramifications for that for third-party groups like social media, like newspaper sites, it is really great, and it's probably still being considered in truth, but it's a really interesting case of where the courts have played a role in relation to it. Okay. So I'll very briefly talk about the legislative tools. If we could just flip through this one, please. We've got three strands of legislation that we use for hate crime in the UK. The first is the incitement offences, which are there for race, religion and sexual orientation. But they're rarely used. They're reserved for, if you like, mission racists. They're reserved for people who are trying to stir up racial hatred on a grand scale. And we probably prosecute about 4 cases a year of inciting racial hatred on average. We've had 1 successful prosecution for the other 2 in 6 and 9 years that they've been in existence. So they're very rarely used. What we do have is racially aggravated public order offences. So we have racially aggravated offences for minor public order, minor assaults, criminal damage and harassment. So they create specific racial offences, which the government has asked the Law Commission to decide whether they should be extended to disability, sexual orientation and transgender as well. But what we do have is enhanced sentencing legislation under Section 146 of the Criminal Justice Act, which basically says that any crime, the court must enhance the sentence and declare that they've done so, where they're satisfied that evidence is provided that shows that the offence was motivated by, or the offender demonstrated hostility based on the grounds of race, religion, sexual orientation, disability and transgender. So, okay. What I'm going to do on the next slide, if I may. Can we go through this one? Because I'm going to run out of time. Alright, okay. I'll just give a warning. I've got some slides now which show the challenge about dealing with this. There's nothing gratuitous on here. Some of the material is offensive. I've taken out some of the most gratuitous, the most offensive materials. But it's really one of the things to show is the nature of the material that gets reported to the police, but also the fact that some of the most damaging is the least likely to be illegal. So if we can just go through some of these. This is a really high-profile case from this region. This is a young man, Fabrice Mwamba, was a football player who collapsed while playing football. Ian Stacey, a young student from South Wales, posted some fairly horrible racist comments on him as he collapsed in the aftermath of his collapse, and was convicted of a racially aggravated public order offence. And for me, this is one of a whole range of cases which, although they've been dealt with at the lower court and as such are not binding on all courts, they seem to indicate that the courts have accepted that the internet is a public space. And that's certainly the message that the CPS have given and the police have given, is to people not to consider it as that they can't do on the internet what they wouldn't do in front of a police officer on the street. And I think that's a really important message, because Ian Stacey was tweeting to what he thought were his 32 friends, but because it's a searchable record and people found it and retweeted it, it always obviously caused a much greater exposure than was perhaps intended. So if I can move on. We've got material here which is a really innocuous story of a young lad who opens a biscuit and in Arabic he finds a pattern on it which reads, which looks like the word Allah on a biscuit. And it's posted on Facebook. And what you see down the side, or what you probably can't see down the side, is a really deeply offensive racist material aimed at that young lad. And he's probably not going to be exposed to it because he's too young to be on Facebook and it's probably somebody else's account. But the reality of this, there's really but there was probably about 100 different people posting stuff that could conceivably be illegal. So you're talking about 100 offences out of one comment on one innocuous page. So the capacity issue is really huge to us. And they were probably, they certainly weren't incitement offences, but they were probably public order offences. So move on, please. So what we've got stuff here, which is stuff that you can see is deeply offensive. It's intended to be offensive, it's deeply racist, or hostile on the grounds of religion. And these are things which would probably, and I say probably, be considered to be illegal. They may not even have been posted in this country, in which case the jurisdiction issue is an issue. But they are probably illegal. So move on. And here's stuff that's probably illegal. This is satire. If you take, for instance, the one on the right, which you can probably see better, the people who were posting that would probably argue that this was about combating misogynistic violence. This was about a problem that has existed within communities around the world, and it's a problem of violence against women. So they would claim to be espousing the civil rights of women to be free from targeted abuse, which not many people would argue. But when you look at who's posting it, you wonder whether that's really the motive, or whether it's about demonising the community to further a political point. But the reality of it is they would claim legitimacy. And there's another example I'll move on. I took one off this page, which was a depiction of the Prophet Muhammad as a paedophile abducting a child. Again, it's a message about child protection. Here is a message about child protection. There is nothing on there that's wrong. These are convicted paedophiles. These are people that it says not all Muslims are terrorists. Not all Muslims are terrorists. Some of them are paedophiles and rapists too. Some of them are. These individuals are. So you look at it and say, well, actually, is this about children's rights, or is this about demonising the community? So it's very much about context and about how things are used, which makes the point. So if we move on, please. You've got things like this which cause offence. I mean, some of the materials that about the depictions of the Prophet, for instance, some of the materials here deeply cause offence, but are political satire. These examples of things that are kind of satiring religion in general, but would cause offence. Okay, move on. And here's one that probably caused the most distress amongst my team that I work with. And Adani Rose is a 6-year-old American girl. She's got a terminal illness, really sort of horrific condition that is terminal. And her mother took her onto what is the American equivalent of GMTV to expose the situation that a daughter was in and to call for medical aid. And what you saw was a response to it from lots of young American individuals, men I would guess, creating these sites. And this is amongst the least offensive that we chose to use. And these were on Facebook, and at the time Facebook said these were acceptable humour. They've changed the policy now, and this definitely wouldn't be. But this was the sort of material that was being posted. And as you can see, it's really vile, and it caused so much distress. Now, we know that the offenders are not likely to have been in the UK. We know that the victim is unlikely to be exposed to the hostility, and certainly isn't going to be in the UK. But actually, we had around about 100 or 150 people who made contact with us, saying how distressing they found this material. So what this clearly isn't going to be a criminal offence in the UK, but is clearly causing distress. So as well as the criminal law that we've got to uphold, we've also got a legal duty to protect people from harassment under the Equalities Act, to protect people from harassment based on their protected characteristics. So I would argue, and I did argue, that we had a moral duty to respond to this, even though we didn't have a legal ground to arrest anybody. So we interacted with the people, asking them to take it down. We posted on their websites, and we did so probably more for the people watching than they would be influenced. But it's a really difficult situation about where does the role of the state and the role to intervene end in this respect. I'm conscious when I lost my remote control, I also lost my time. So, okay, 2 minutes, okay. Right, I'm going to I've talked a bit about the sort of challenges that we've got in relation to the investigation of things. And one of the problems is that if somebody made a telephone call to you, and committed a criminal offence on that telephone call, we would go to BT and we would ask for subscriber details. We'd give them whatever they needed in terms of data protection or court orders, and they would give us the subscriber detail. But actually there's a third party involved now. So for us to go to the providers, so the Virgins and the BTs who provide the internet services or the sort of cell services, we've got to go to the host, which is Twitter and Facebook and sort of a self-hosted site, and ask them for the information that's posted on there, because the IP address is obviously visible to them, not to us. And that's where the problem comes down. We set up a process that we would do this when we started to intervene in these things, and we never once got to use it in relation to our services, but because we never got the IP address. So if we can just finish up on the... So I'm going to go through this and we'll cover this in our slides. So could we go to the next slide, please? The more astute people say that, I should duplicate that. All right, okay. I talked about it, the internet being the solution, and actually the internet is largely the solution to many of these problems as well. So here's a site called True Vision, which is a police-owned site. It's funded by grants from government and it's owned by the police. It's now, as of this week, been launched in a Welsh language version of it as well as an English language version. And what it does is it provides resources that people can utilise. It provides information to professionals and to victims alike. It provides a library of resources that's downloadable and can be utilised locally. But it also allows the ability to report online. So it's not quite as boring as most police websites, but it's still a static website. So you've actually got to get people to it. Some of the resources on there are really fantastic. They've been developed in local partnerships or by NGOs, and we steal them and share them. But obviously you've got to get people to it. It has around 16,000 visits a month during busy months. It's ranging between about 11 and 16,000, which is about 4 times as many as hate crimes that we record. So it's well received in terms of being seen. But really, to get people to it, and if we move on, you've got to provide the resources like mobile phone apps and like a social media sort of Facebook page in particular. And then I'm just going to finish, if I can, onto the next slide, by just giving an example of how we can help. So you're presumably here because you have a role or an interest in solving these problems. And True Vision can help by providing that place for people to be, but also it can reach out to people through social media. And I'm going to advertise one of Nick's competitors now, and Twitter's obviously just as good. So we produced here with West Mercia Police and Telford Deaf Club and Wolverhampton College, produced a British Sign Language video, which is obviously intended for people who use British Sign Language, to explain to them about hate crime and about how they can be protected. So we produced that video. What this shows, this is a summary of the 28-day advertising campaign. And to give it context, the census says there's 6,000 people who are BSL users in the UK. And what the charities will say there's probably about 10 times that, because people didn't fill it in. But what this says is this can get to 16,000 of those people. So on this occasion, it reached 14,306 of the people, 125 times over a month's period. And 688, so that's 1 or 10% of the population, depending on who you believe, watched the video, which is a phenomenal take-up of a specifically targeted video, and the cost was 251 quid. So I'll leave you with the offer that says that if you've got local or national initiatives that you want to run that support victims of hate crime and support services of hate crime, True Vision can provide a resource for you and has got some money